Have you ever signed something super important and later realized, it wasn't quite what you thought it was?
Oh, yeah, we've all been there. That feeling of, wait, what did I just agree to?
Well, imagine that on a national scale, because that's exactly what happened in 1840 in New Zealand with the Treaty of Waitangi.
Ah, the Treaty of Waitangi, a document that shaped an entire nation, yet it had two versions, English and Maori, with some pretty significant differences.
And those differences had some major consequences, sparking debates that continue even to this day.
So, are we ready to dive into this historical puzzle?
Absolutely. Let's unpack the Treaty of Waitangi, explore its complexities, and try to understand its lasting impact.
Sounds like a plan. What makes this treaty so fascinating is that it was aiming for something really unique, especially for the time.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What do you mean?
Well, they were trying to create a genuine partnership between the indigenous Maori people and the British Crown, a real balance of power.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea for the colonial era, wasn't it?
It definitely was. Now, to really grasp the weight of this treaty, we need to rewind back to the early 1800s in New Zealand.
Okay, so picture this. A land teeming with European explorers, whalers, sealers, missionaries.
All interacting with this vibrant and complex Maori culture with their own established tribal systems.
It was a real cultural melting pot, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And as you can imagine, with all these different groups and interests bumping into each other, tensions started to rise.
Makes sense, especially with no real formal system of governance in place.
Right. It was a bit of a recipe for, shall we say, disagreements, especially with some of those less than law-abiding British subjects entering the mix.
Oh yeah, can't forget about those escaped convicts from New South Wales. They definitely added to the drama.
They did. So amidst all this growing unrest, enters James Busby, the British resident.
Ah, Busby.
Yeah.
He had this grand title, but not a lot of actual power, did he?
Not really. He was more like a diplomat representing the crown's interests, but without the resources or the authority to truly enforce them. People even nicknamed him the man of war without guns.
Clever. So what did this man of war without guns actually do?
Well, despite his limitations, Busby made a pretty bold move. He drafted the Declaration of Independence of the Northern Chiefs.
Hold on, a Declaration of Independence. That sounds pretty significant.
It was. This declaration basically acknowledged Maori sovereignty.
Wow. But was it really about independence, or was there more to it?
You're right to be skeptical. It was likely a strategic move, especially with the French sniffing around looking for potential colonies.
Ah, so a bit of a power play to keep the French out.
Precisely. But even though it might have been more calculated than a genuine push for complete independence, it had an interesting ripple effect.
What do you mean?
It really solidified the idea of Maori nationhood, which, believe it or not, wasn't as central to their worldview before that.
Interesting. So we have a rapidly changing landscape, tensions bubbling, a growing European presence, and the Maori becoming increasingly aware of their collective strength.
That's a great summary, and that's where William Hobson enters the scene, sent by the British government in 1839.
With a mission to.
To negotiate a treaty with the Maori people. And get this, his instructions were to ensure fairness, justice, and good faith.
Sounds almost too good to be true, doesn't it? Like, were the British suddenly having a change of heart?
Well, it was definitely a departure from the usual colonial playbook. But those seemingly good intentions were still wrapped up in a deeply ingrained paternalistic view.
Right, that classic assumption that indigenous people needed European guidance to, manage their own affairs.
Exactly. So Hobson, working alongside his secretary, and James Busby, found themselves in a bit of a time crunch to draft this all-important treaty.
I bet. A treaty isn't exactly something you whip up overnight.
You'd think so, right? They invited Maori chiefs to a big meeting, but here's the catch. They didn't have a translated version of the treaty ready until the very night before.
Oh, no. Talk about a last-minute scramble. So who ended up doing the translation?
That crucial task fell to missionary Henry Williams and his son.
A missionary. That seems like it could lead to some interesting interpretations.
It certainly did, and those interpretations would have huge consequences down the line.
Can't wait to dig into that. So what happened at this grand meeting? Did everyone just sign on the dotted line?
Well, on February 6, 1840, history was made at Busby's residence. After a lot of discussion, 45 Maori chiefs signed the Treaty of Waitangi.
45. That's a lot of chiefs. Was there anyone who, wasn't so keen on signing?
Definitely. Some Maori leaders were suspicious of British intentions, some were worried about losing autonomy, and some simply didn't have the chance to sign because copies of the treaty didn't reach every corner of the islands.
So not exactly a unanimous decision then.
Nope. But here's the thing. The British government considered the treaty as binding on all Maori, regardless of whether they had signed it or not.
Interesting. So even if a Maori chief hadn't signed the treaty, the British still considered them bound by it. That seems a bit one-sided.
It does, doesn't it? And to make things even more complicated, they considered the English version to be the definitive text.
Even though there were two versions, the English and the Maori.
Exactly. And there were, shall we say, some notable discrepancies between the two.
Ah, yes, those discrepancies. So now we're getting to the heart of the matter. The differences between the English and Maori versions of the Treaty of Waitangi.
Right. We're not talking about just little translation quirks here. These are fundamental differences that have fueled debates for decades.
Okay, lay it on me. What are we talking about here?
Well, let's start with Article 1.
Oh.
The English version says Maori chiefs ceded sovereignty to the Queen, but the Maori translation used a word closer to governorship.
Hold on, sovereignty versus governorship. Those are two very different things.
Exactly. And it wasn't a simple oversight. There wasn't a direct Maori equivalent for sovereignty. This highlights how tricky it can be to translate complex ideas between cultures.
It really makes you wonder, were these discrepancies deliberate on the part of the British? Or were they just, honest mistakes?
That's a question historians are still grappling with today. No easy answers there. But the fact that these discrepancies always seem to favor the British does raise some eyebrows.
I can see why. So what about Article 2? Anything interesting there?
Oh, Article 2 is where things get even more complicated. The English version guaranteed Maori full exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands. But the Maori version used a phrase that's closer to the full essence of chieftainship.
Wait, so one version talks about land ownership and the other about, what, leadership or authority?
Yes. It's almost like they were signing two completely different agreements.
Wow. Okay, so two very different interpretations of what it meant to have control over their lands. Did anything else stand out?
Well, there's also the translation of forests, fisheries, and other properties in Article 2. The Maori version uses the word treasures, which, well, that opens up a whole can of worms.
How so?
Because what exactly constitutes a treasure? Could it include things like cultural elements, language, even the very core of Maori identity?
Ah, I see. Those are pretty big questions, and I bet those ambiguities have fueled a lot of the debate about what the treaty really meant, right?
They absolutely have, and we'll delve into those debates and the impact they had on New Zealand as we continue our deep dive.
Treasures, huh? That one word really highlights how much can get lost in translation, especially when you're dealing with such different cultures. But I'm curious what happened after the treaty was signed. Did those differences in interpretation actually play out in real life?
Oh, absolutely. Even though the Treaty of Waitangi aimed for a balanced partnership, the reality on the ground ended up being, well, quite different.
More like business as usual for the British Empire.
Sadly, yes. The flood of British settlers and the setup of a very European-style government led to, no surprise here, a whole lot of conflicts and injustices.
It's a familiar story, unfortunately. So, what became of the Maori people after the treaty? Did they just fade into the background as British influence took over?
Not at all. While they were initially shut out of the official government, the Maori never gave up on their claims or their identity. They actively fought for recognition, for their rights, and for a voice in how things were run.
That's pretty inspiring. And their efforts eventually paid off, right? I mean, New Zealand today is known for being pretty multicultural and committed to reconciliation.
Yes, but it has been a long and complicated journey. Maori men finally got the right to vote in 1867, and dedicated Maori seats were established in Parliament, a system that's still in place today.
Though I imagine there's still debate about whether those dedicated seats are the best way to go.
There is indeed. It's fascinating how something intended to be temporary, like those seats, has become such a permanent feature of their political landscape. It shows just how much effort goes into trying to find a balance between upholding the treaty's spirit and adapting to the realities of a diverse modern nation.
It's a balancing act for sure.
Mm.
So what else happened along the way? Were there any other key turning points?
Well, in 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was created specifically to investigate Maori claims that the treaty had been violated.
So basically a way to hold the government accountable to the treaty's promises.
Exactly. At first, it mainly focused on current issues, but in 1985, its scope was broadened dramatically to include historical grievances going all the way back to 1840.
Wow, that's a big step. To acknowledge that injustices from decades or even centuries ago still matter today. It shows a commitment to dealing with the effects of colonization, at least in theory.
It certainly does. It's about recognizing that true reconciliation means confronting the past, not sweeping it under the rug. The Waitangi Tribunal has been instrumental in giving Maori a platform and making people face the complexities of the treaty and the need for continued conversation.
It sounds like they've been doing some important work. So if we fast forward to New Zealand today, what's the picture like? How does the Treaty of Waitangi's legacy show up in their government, their society, and their sense of who they are as a nation?
Well, New Zealand today is a really interesting mix. It's a parliamentary democracy with the prime minister leading the government, but it's also still a constitutional monarchy with the British monarch as head of state, represented by a governor general.
Wait, so they have a queen, but also a prime minister calling the shots. That sounds a bit confusing.
It might seem that way, but in practice, the monarch's role is mostly symbolic. It's a nod to the historical connection, while the real political power is with the elected government. And of course, we can't forget that Te Reo Maori, the Maori language, is officially recognized alongside English and New Zealand Sign Language.
That's a big deal. Recognizing the indigenous language is a powerful symbol of respect, a far cry from the days when those languages were often suppressed or pushed aside. It says a lot about how attitudes have changed, don't you think?
I completely agree. The revitalization of Te Reo Maori has been remarkably successful. It really shows the resilience of Maori culture and the growing understanding that it's vital to New Zealand's national identity.
So despite its flaws and all the debate about what it really means, the Treaty of Waitangi has ultimately shaped New Zealand into a nation that tries to honor its multicultural heritage. It's a fascinating story of both struggle and progress, a reminder that creating a fair and just society is an ongoing process that never really ends.
And it's a process that needs open and honest conversations, a willingness to confront the difficult parts of history, and a commitment to understanding where everyone is coming from. The Treaty of Waitangi is still a touchstone for these vital discussions, a living document that guides New Zealand's path toward reconciliation.
It really is amazing to think about how one document signed way back in 1840 still has such a huge impact on New Zealand today.
Right. It just goes to show how important it was in shaping the country's identity and that whole complicated relationship with its indigenous people.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who've joined us on this deep dive into the Treaty of Waitangi,
Mm.
what's the one big takeaway? What's the thing they should remember?
I'd say it's this. Real reconciliation. It's not just about saying sorry for past wrongs. It's about constantly engaging in open, honest conversations and being willing to truly listen and learn from different perspectives.
That's a powerful thought. And it makes you wonder if those Maori chiefs who signed the treaty could see New Zealand today. How would they feel?
Oh, that's a good question. What would they think about this nation that's wrestling with its colonial history while also trying to build a more inclusive future?
Would they see progress? Would they be disappointed? Or maybe a little bit of both.
It really gets you thinking, doesn't it, about how the past shapes the present and how we're all part of this journey towards justice and understanding.
It does. And it reminds us that the story of the Treaty of Waitangi, it's not over yet. It's still being written every day, and we all have a role to play in how it unfolds.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Treaty of Waitangi.
A complex and fascinating story full of twists and turns and ongoing debates. If you enjoyed this journey back in time, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive for more explorations into history's most intriguing events.
And remember, history, it's not just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future. So keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.